Thanksgiving is supposed to be about family, food, and being thankful, but for me, it was the night my mom told everyone she was cutting me out of her will, and my brother thought he had won. We were all sitting around the table, still eating turkey and mashed potatoes. The fireplace was warm, and people were chatting. Everything seemed normal, until my mom stood up. She tapped her glass with a fork, smiled, and said, "I have an important announcement." I knew it was going to be bad. She looked at me, then at my brother, Bryan, who was already smirking. Then she said, "When I die, everything I own, my house, my money, everything, will go to Bryan, because Alex doesn't deserve anything." The room went silent. Someone shifted in their chair. A fork scraped a plate. I just sat there, shocked. She said it so casually, like it was nothing. Bryan leaned back, looking pleased. I wasn't surprised, he had always been the favorite. He got the best of everything growing up, while I got whatever was left, but I never thought my mom would go this far. I took a deep breath. "Are you serious?" She nodded. "You never appreciate me, you don't listen, Bryan does." I scoffed. "Because I don't treat you like a queen?" Her eyes narrowed. "Because you're selfish." People at the table looked uncomfortable. My uncle shifted. My aunt gave a nervous laugh, but my grandmother, sitting at the far end, just watched quietly. Bryan finally spoke. "Sounds fair to me," he said, grinning. "I've always been there for Mom." "You left." I clenched my fists. "Yeah, I moved out because I was treated like garbage. I built my own life." Meanwhile, Bryan still lives at home. He's 38, unemployed, and has never paid a single bill, and now he thinks he's getting everything. But then, my grandmother cleared her throat. Everyone turned to look at her. She was 94, but her mind was sharp. A man behind her stood up, holding a briefcase. I hadn't even noticed him before. A lawyer. My mom's smile vanished. "What do you mean?" she asked, suddenly tense. My grandmother placed her hand on the table. "You don't own this house, Margaret, you never did." Silence. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Grandma took a deep breath and nodded at the lawyer. He pulled out a stack of papers. "This house," she said, "was never yours to give away." My mom's face turned pale. Bryan sat up, looking nervous. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "According to a legal agreement from 1976, this house and all financial assets are in an irrevocable trust." My mom froze. Bryan's smirk disappeared. "A what?" he blurted out. The lawyer continued. "A trust that cannot be changed, which means, Margaret, you have never legally owned this house. Your mother does, and she decides who inherits it." The room was dead silent. Bryan looked like he had been punched in the gut. My mom didn't move. Then, for the first time that night, my grandmother smiled. "And I've already made my decision." The lawyer flipped through the papers. "As per the trust," he said, looking at me, "everything goes to Alex." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe what I had just heard. "What?" my mom snapped. Bryan jumped out of his chair. "No, that's not possible. This is my house." The lawyer stayed calm, adjusting his glasses. "Actually, no, as I explained, your grandfather put this house in an irrevocable trust. It was never legally given to your mother. When he passed, full control went to your grandmother, with clear instructions on who would inherit it." Bryan was furious. "This has to be a mistake. Mom's been living here for years." "That's right," my mom added, finding her voice again. "I raised my children in this house. I took care of it." My grandmother slowly turned to her voice colder than I had ever heard. "Oh, is that what you think?" She leaned forward, resting her wrinkled hands on the table. "Margaret, you never paid a single cent for this house. Your father and I did. We let you stay here because we trusted you to be responsible, but do you know what we found out?" She paused, then said, "You took out loans against it." The room went silent. My stomach dropped. A few people gasped. My mother flinched like she had been slapped. "That's not true," she spat. I don't know what you're talking about." The lawyer turned a page and read, "Over the past 15 years, you have taken out multiple loans using this house as collateral, assuming you owned it. These loans total over $250,000. "No," my mom said, slamming her hands on the table, "that's a lie." The lawyer didn't even look up. "You defaulted on several loans, putting liens on the house. Last year, you tried to borrow another $50,000 but were denied because the property isn't legally yours." My mom turned pale. She looked at Bryan, desperate. "Bryan, say something." But Bryan looked like he was about to be sick. I had never seen him look so afraid. "Mom, is this true?" She didn't answer. My grandmother sighed, shaking her head. "You lied to your own son. You let him believe everything would be his while secretly draining this house of every last dollar." Her voice was cold, disgusting. I was still trying to process everything when Bryan suddenly exploded. "This isn't fair," he yelled. "I stayed here, I took care of you, and now you're telling me I get nothing?" The lawyer looked at him. Not exactly. Bryan froze. What? The lawyer slid a document across the table. Your grandmother is giving you a choice. Bryan grabbed the paper, his face twisting with rage. This is a joke. I looked at the paper in Bryan's hands, and my breath caught. What is it? I asked. My grandmother folded her hands. I'm offering Bryan $50,000, but only if he moves out immediately and never contacts me again. The room went silent. Bryan looked like he'd been punched. You're kicking me out? Grandma didn't flinch. Yes. My mother gasped. You can't do that. I can, Grandma said calmly. You thought you were in charge, Margaret. You planned to cut Alex out and give everything to Bryan, but the truth is, this was never yours to give. I let you stay in my house out of kindness, and now that kindness is over. Bryan turned to our mom, his voice desperate. Mom, do something. But she sat there, frozen. She had lost, and she knew it. Bryan turned back to the lawyer. I'm not leaving, you can't make me. The lawyer nodded, as if he expected this. That's your choice, but if you refuse the payout, we'll move forward with legal eviction. Bryan's eyes widened. Eviction? You can't evict me. The lawyer flipped a page. Under state law, you're considered a tenant. You haven't contributed financially in over 10 years. Now that the house is transferring ownership, the new owner has the right to remove you. Bryan looked at me, desperate. You wouldn't do that, right, Alex? We're brothers. I just stared at him. After years of watching him get everything while I was treated like nothing, I finally had the power, and I was going to use it. Bryan's hands clenched the contract so hard his knuckles turned white. My mother sat in shock, her eyes darting between Grandma, the lawyer, and me. She had planned to humiliate me tonight, but instead, she had just learned she was never in control. Bryan pushed back his chair, his plate rattling. This is, no, Grandma said, this is justice. Bryan turned to me, furious. This isn't fair, Alex, you don't even want this house. I've lived here my whole life. I leaned back, feeling something new, power. That's funny, you didn't care about fairness when Mom tried to cut me out. Bryan's face turned red. This is different. No, Bryan, it isn't. After years of being pushed aside, it was finally my turn. The lawyer slid another paper across the table. You have 30 days to leave, Bryan. If you don't, we'll start the eviction process. Bryan snatched the paper and crushed it in his fist. I'm not going anywhere. Silence. Then, my grandmother chuckled. Oh, Bryan, you always thought throwing a tantrum would get you what you wanted. She took a slow sip of tea. But you forget, I know everything. Bryan froze. Then she said something that changed everything. I know about the second mortgage. The secret that destroyed everything. Bryan went pale. My mother sucked in a sharp breath. You don't know anything, Bryan stammered. Grandma smiled. Oh, but I do. You took out a second mortgage on this house, didn't you? That's a lie, my mother shrieked. Is it? The lawyer pulled out another document and placed it on the table. Bryan lunged for it, but I was faster. I grabbed it and read the words that made my stomach drop. Oh my God, I whispered, looking between Bryan and my mother. I couldn't even finish, because what I was reading was worse than I ever imagined. Bryan had taken out a second mortgage, and he had done it behind my mother's back. You forged Mom's signature, I said. Bryan was sweating. Mom was supposed to inherit everything anyway, it didn't matter. I turned to my mother, waiting for her to explode, but she didn't. She just sat there, shaking, because she knew that now that the house belonged to me, Bryan's crime became my problem. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, on my property. Then it hit me. I turned to my grandmother. Wait, you knew about this before tonight, didn't you? She smiled. Of course I did. That's why I made sure the house went to you. My breath caught. What? Why? Because I knew what they would do to you if I didn't, she said, turning to my mother and Bryan. They would have drained this house dry and left you with nothing. I refused to let that happen. I leaned back, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was war. I'll fight this, Bryan hissed, his anger palpable. The lawyer remained calm, pulling out one last document. You already lost. Bryan grabbed the paper and scanned it, his hands trembling. No. He slammed it on the table, face flushed with rage. I picked it up and read, unable to suppress a laugh. My grandmother had been one step ahead the entire time. The document was a court order. Bryan, Grandma's voice was cold as steel. You don't just owe money on this house, you committed fraud. Bryan shook his head violently. No, you can't do this. Oh, but I can, she said. The bank knows about your little stunt. The authorities do too. If you don't accept the payout and leave quietly, they'll press charges. Bryan froze, all color draining from his face. This was no longer about losing the house, this was about losing his freedom. You have 48 hours to decide, the lawyer said smoothly. Take the payout and leave, or we go to the police. My mother suddenly broke down in tears. Please, Mom, don't do this, he's your grandson. Grandma didn't blink. No, he stopped being my grandson the moment he stole from his own family. For the first time, Bryan looked defeated. And me? I just sat back, feeling the weight of justice settling in. Grandma was the most ruthless woman I had ever known. For the next few moments, there was total silence. Bryan looked at the contract, hands shaking. My mother sobbed quietly, completely broken. Grandma remained calm, as if she'd known from the start how it would end. So, she asked, what's it going to be, Bryan? Bryan's eyes darted around the table, searching for a way out. Then, suddenly, he snapped. No, he said, shoving back his chair. No, I'm not leaving, you can't do this to me. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the papers and tore them in half. You think you can just erase me? I'll burn this house down before I let you take it. And just like that, he snapped. He lunged at me, grabbing my shirt and yanking me forward so hard my chair almost tipped over. You don't deserve this, I'm the rightful owner. His spit hit my face. Then, crack. Bryan stumbled back, clutching his face. My grandmother had slapped him, hard enough that it echoed in the room. Bryan, she said coldly, you made your choice. Then, she turned to the lawyer. Call the police. Bryan froze. What? I gave you a choice, you threw it away, now you get the other option. The lawyer was already on his phone. Bryan's face twisted in panic. Wait, I'll take the money, I'll leave. Too late, Grandma said. In the distance, sirens grew louder. Bryan turned to my mother. Mom, do something. For the first time in her life, my mother was silent. She just shook her head. She knew it was his fault. 10 minutes later, Bryan was dragged out of the house in handcuffs, screaming and begging, but no one helped him. This isn't fair, you're ruining my life. I stood on the porch, watching as the police shoved him into the car. No, Bryan, I said calmly, you ruined it yourself. The car door slammed, and as it pulled away, he was gone. I took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Bryan was charged with fraud. Apparently, this wasn't his first time forging signatures. The bank had been investigating him for months, and my grandmother had just accelerated the process. He ended up serving time. As for my mother, she tried to fight back. She screamed, cried, and begged Grandma to reconsider, but Grandma was done. She gave her one final chance. You can stay for 6 more months, after that, you leave, or Alex will have you evicted. My mother left in 4. She moved into a small apartment and tried to reconnect with me, but I wasn't interested. I helped her when she needed it, but I never forgot what she did, and I never let her close enough to hurt me again. The final blow? I renovated the house, fixed what they had destroyed, and when it was done, I hosted a Thanksgiving dinner, inviting everyone except my mother and Bryan. They didn't deserve a seat at my table. As I looked around at the people who truly cared about me, I knew I had won.